Ladies and gentlemen, my guest today is a man of eminent scholarship, but if I stay there, if I stop there, that would be only half of his introduction. He is a prolific author. He is somebody who has captivated through his not only his observations, words, writings, India's economic journey transformation, but has also encapsulated it in so many places. In his current role, he happens to hold a very, very critical job. As the chairperson of the 16th Finance Commission, Mr. Arvind Panagariya will decide how the finances are distributed between the states and the government of India. However, I am not meeting Mr. Arvind Panagariya today for that purpose. I am meeting him for his latest book, and he has written a book on the first Prime Minister of India, as a man of his scholarship must, the Nehru Development Model. Mr. Panagariya, welcome to NDTV.
My pleasure to be with you.
Mr. Panagariya, let me ask you a question. I tried to read this book, and let me confess that I could not finish it because of...
It's a thick book.
It's a thick book, and for the paucity of time, I received it during a working week, so probably it would had it been a weekend, I would have finished it.
Yes.
But you've given reasons why you have written it. You have written about the unfortunate death of your brother during the COVID years, and then how you were writing an article, and then it transformed into a book. But what's the provocation, Mr. Panagariya, at this stage to write a book on Mr. Nehru's development model? What's the idea?
No real provocation really, but what I think, not quite sure whether it's a prospective explanation, retrospective, but to be sure, while a lot has been written on post-independence history of India on the political side, on the economic side, hardly anything. Particularly, if one takes the contemporary period, meaning last 20-30 years, lot on the post-independence history, political history that is, but hardly anything on the economic history. Now, while this period, Nehru era, was unfolding, a lot of writings were happening at that time, but we also need to, sometimes go back and look at the events from today's vantage point. And that really, if you will, is the provocation. And ultimately, of course, we also want to learn from the past. So that is the effort. Both, we try to learn from the past, but we also try to explain the present in the context of what happened in the past. So both of those motivations drive the analysis of the book.
And it's interesting that you talk about political writings on Mr. Nehru and Mr. Nehru's governance, even during the contemporary times, because you have written in your book, Mr. Panagariya, that Pandit Nehru embarked on two projects simultaneously when India became independent. One was a political project, and another was a financial or economic project. You say that he succeeded so stupendously in the political project that even when his daughter, these are your words, even when his daughter tried to tinker with those institutions, she flirted, as you say. Right. When she flirted briefly, she had to revert to the original and very, very brief flirtation, disastrous as it is, she reverted to it. How is it, Mr. Panagariya, that the analysis of your book, or the sum and summation of your book, while Pandit Nehru succeeds on one side stupendously, on the other side it appears that he fails miserably?
Yes. Well, I think, his, as the book explains, his original instincts were absolutely right. What he wanted to achieve for India is something that we still try to achieve for India, namely the eradication of poverty and making India prosperous. So his instincts were in this sense quite right, that the whole purpose, in fact he even wrote in somewhere, maybe in the Discovery of India, that or even before that, maybe in the autobiography, somewhere I quote that that
yes, Discovery of India,
that ultimately the purpose of independence is also to eradicate the appalling poverty of India. So he also recognized very rightly actually that this could not be done without industrialization and growth, because in his own words, he said that the incomes were so low, existing wealth was so little, that redistribution simply, there was simply not enough wealth to redistribute. There was only poverty to redistribute. And so therefore, he saw industrialization and growth as the instrument of eradicating poverty. So on those counts, he was correct. But now, how to stimulate growth, and the model that he ended up picking turned out to be the wrong one. And so the kind of growth that was required, again, going back to his own ambition, he wrote that, look, we recognized when we had held these discussions that to eradicate poverty completely in a matter of about 10 years or a decade, we will need 600% increase or six-fold increase in income. But that was too ambitious, so we set a goal of 300% or threefold increase in income. So again, very correct analysis up to that point, but then when it came to what path to choose, this is where his own kind of inclinations towards heavy industry, towards socialism, that kind of came in the way, as we later learned.
Before I come back to the socialism part on which you describe Pandit Nehru's journey from Fabian to radical, I'll come to that. But essentially what you are saying is that his diagnosis was right, but the medicine that he chose turned out to be incorrect.
You can put it that way, yes.
And there was caution. You said that while bulk of the economists were agreeing to what Pandit Nehru was saying, even the industrialists, corporates, etc., were agreeing to his philosophy of a mixed economy, private corporates, etc., etc. In the form of Mr. Milton, in the form of
Milton Friedman, yes.
Milton Friedman, you have mentioned Mr. Milton Friedman. There was a caution, and you say that that caution were to be proved absolutely correct,
100%.
In the years to come. But you also write in your book, Mr. Panagariya, that because Mr. Milton was traveling at the instance of the American government, the United States government, there was no chance of him succeeding. Those are your words.
Right. So what I also say is that, so this note, 4,000 word note that Milton Friedman wrote while spending a few weeks in New Delhi, was written in 1955. And till then, Milton Friedman didn't have much acceptance even within the United States, at least among the academics. So he was still yet to be accepted by the larger academic community in the United States itself. So this is what I sort of say, that therefore they had no prayer of being heard in India. And sure enough, that's what happened really, there is no mention, I don't think anybody knew about the note that he wrote, except his fellow traveler, P.T. Bauer, who quotes him in a 1960 book that he wrote, very short book on India. But the wider audience really came to know of that note only around somewhere in the 1980s, when Subrata Roy, I think, discovered this and brought it out in a volume. I myself came to see it only around in 2000, when I actually wrote on that note an Economic Times column.
So you mean to say that he was yet to acquire the kind of fame or the heft that he acquired?
Acceptance. He was known, but his acceptance, his brand of economics
was still
not accepted. Was not accepted, basically.
So
he was very pro-market. He was free trade. He was flexible exchange rates. These ideas had not yet been accepted. He gained over time incredible acceptance, actually, and
became a very big
became
name.
a very influential economist in the United States eventually. But that was still to happen. 1955 was still early. And he won the Nobel Prize, by the way.
Yes. And so it was not something very jarring that his advice was confined to the bins of...
No, it's not jarring. No. I mean, around this time in 1956 and 1955, before that, when discussions are happening on the second 5-year plan, when Modinomics writes the second plan frame, that is the framework for the second 5-year plan. Conventional wisdom is that you got to do planning, you got to industrialize, you got to do heavy industry. We should also remember that till this time, even Soviet Union is generally seen as a success. So in this sense, there is a lot of acceptance. Of course, our own academics. There's in assessing the plan frame that Modinomics had written. There was a panel of economists, India's 21 leading economists from different parts of the country.
Prime Minister assembled.
Came in. He assembled
that
Prime
Minister assembled.
Because he believed in consultation and all. So he assembles that whole team, and they all look at it, and if anything, actually, they want more control
than
what was in the Modinomics
paper
plan frame. Yeah. So,
Mr. Panagariya, let's come back to the historical figure in this book, that is the first Prime Minister himself. You said that he was also in your book. You say that he was also driven by his own instinct. And you say that he was at some point in time a radical communist, and he was quite impressed by the Soviet communism.
Yes.
And then he traveled probably to a more pragmatic view of socialism or communism, what did you call it, Fabian socialism.
Fabian or mixed economy.
Mixed economy, which you have also written. So you think that the first Prime Minister of this country was quite radical communist in his leanings at some point in time?
Well, I don't have to say that I think so. It's in his writings. One of the quotes I reproduce in the book says, he once issued a press note saying that there are only two choices before us, fascism and communism, and between those two I choose communism. But there are other writings of his, including actually a presidential address in the Lucknow AICC, All India Congress Committee conference, where he very forcefully expresses this view that he extols the Soviet experience and says that the only thing that can ultimately tame or defeat capitalism, which leads to imperialism, is the some form of coordinated socialist, international socialist movement, or various countries coming together, forming these socialist governments around the world. So he's clearly very radical in this view. And the transition, I think, happens over the following decade, between 1936 and 1946.
And when, of course, he comes into governance, then that probably mellows everyone down.
That also, but I think my own read here is that there was a committee called the National Planning Committee, which was appointed by Subhash Chandra Bose in 1938, within the Congress Party, that is, and that had 14 members. Nehru chaired that committee, and among the 14 members, there were 3 or 4 leading industrialists. That's where Nehru sort of meets his match kind of on the other side, on the market side. Because the industrialists are very worried. In fact, there is also a story that after that his Lucknow presidential address, industrialists had got very worried that the kind of, because Nehru in that address talks about nationalizing everything, the government becoming the public sector. He did a bit, but much less. Nothing like
Indira did later.
Earlier he would be talking about nationalization of all private industry. Effectively more or less the Soviet style. So that got the industrialists very worried, and so these interactions then happened in this committee, which deliberated for 2 years, 38 to 40. Almost till the point that Nehru then gets sent to jail. And that's where somehow abruptly the work of the committee stopped. But there, Nehru himself writes in the Discovery of India that there was a lot of difference of opinion between the industrialists and me, but I learned from them and they learned from me. So the result of that was that they both seemed to have reached a compromise position of what came to be known as the mixed economy. Because not only that the Prime Minister accommodated the private sector, but the private sector also accommodated the public sector, because they wrote that in 1944 and 1945, into parts the Bombay Plan,
Yes,
which was published.
you mentioned
also.
it in great detail about 1944,
And if you look at the Bombay Plan and India's foundational 5-year plan, which is second 5-year plan, not the first.
Not the first, yes.
And that foundational 5-year plan and the Bombay Plan are very similar. You'll be very surprised actually, as to how the two could be so similar. But my read is that it resulted from this interaction.
One influenced the other. That's your reading.
Yes.
Now, let me ask you something, Mr. Panagariya, that wealth redistribution and socialism, these are ideas that are still, and you have mentioned about it that, how Nehru's own philosophy, thought, work plan has had lasting impact for decades on this country's intelligentsia, academia, market economists, everyone including bureaucrats. Yes, you have written it in detail. Even businessmen in detail. Now, these are the ideas that still refuse to go away.
Absolutely.
Congress party, even today sometimes, today sometimes, Mr. Rahul Gandhi sometimes, very vigorously champions ideas of wealth redistribution.
Mr. Rahul Gandhi is all about redistribution.
Yes.
I think, and when the UPA2 was running the country, I remember writing a column where I said that, the view within the government seems to be that the economy is like the Kamdhenu. The mythical cow, who gives without asking for anything. Without asking for anything. But the economy is not Kamdhenu. You got to nurture the economy for it to keep giving you. So that is really, this is where the redistribution. Because a lot of the reforms had happened under Narasimha Rao and Atal Bihari Vajpayee.
For Narasimha Rao, you have quite a praise in this book.
Yes.
That despite Rajiv years and Rajiv, who could have done all of that, you say that, he in 87, 88, you write, he comes back to status quo, almost status quo ante, and says it does, in your words, business as usual.
Yes.
But let me also ask you about this wealth redistribution and the corporate sector and all. We see, Mr. Panagariya, from the principal opposition party today, some sort of an obsessive targeting of certain business groups or wealth redistribution ideas, or in what would be seen in modern day era as radical socialism, talk of radical socialism. Do you think the Indian economy has the capacity to take these kind of shocks?
Well, see, okay, so to make it concrete, let's say, and there are also some economists actually, right, who advocate, for example, some sort of state duty, right, that upon death.
In the Americas also it is inheritance tax and things like that.
Yeah, and a big one, and the UK has very, very large.
Yes, now they have a new one.
So this is all driven by the instinct that, we want to put an end to the billionaires. Or at least, at some point we deprive them of a lot of their wealth.
A lot of their advantage.
Wealth, basically, a lot of their wealth. But you see, you have to think a little harder, because where are those billions sitting? They are not spending that money. Occasionally you might say that, we had this $1 billion or whatever wedding by Mr. Mukesh Ambani's younger son. But by and large, this wealth is not being used for ostentatious consumption. It is being invested.
And most of it is sitting in investments.
It's sitting in investment. Now, think about it, that if you were to tax it away, give it to the government, what do you think will happen to the investment? In the end, will the government be able to generate the kind of return that private investors and our leading actually entrepreneurs are able to generate on their wealth? In the end, you see, it may seem offensive that somebody has such kind of wealth and all, but think a bit harder. You need to continue to accumulate wealth, generate wealth. And who is going to generate wealth better than the entrepreneurs who actually created that wealth in the first place? So it's, to me, much more about allocation of that wealth into good investments. Now, obviously, the government over time will collect revenues on that wealth, because incomes get taxed. As you generate incomes from that wealth, that income gets taxed. So tax revenues will be collected. And as the base of this wealth rises, whoever is owning it, eventually more and more taxes will be collected and they become available for redistribution. So, which is what we are doing. We are running a Narega program. There are a lot of these transfer schemes that we have been running. And lately, of course, these transfers have really caught on. So, every political party is
all over the country
is announcing these. So, redistribution is happening. Unlike, in an authoritarian regime, like in South Korea, Taiwan, when they grew richer in 70s, 80s, there were no redistribution programs at all. All poverty alleviation happened through growth, which lifted all boats. Yeah, which lifted all boats. But we have very early on actually started off
the redistribution of wealth.
A lot of redistribution programs.
Also, Mr. Panagariya, let me ask you this question that about this radical socialism, and then the targeting of the wealth creators themselves, in a sort of a concerted manner, you go after one corporate or the other corporate. We have seen it in the past also happening with various other corporates. It is not for the first time. But do you think is it just that the political might of a political party or establishment goes after a private corporate which probably is not in a position at all to face that might, despite having not done anything, provenly wrong?
Well, I think that gets into the political realm, and I sort of keep a bit away from making political commentary. But in democracies, these things you observe around the world.
Before I close, Mr. Panagariya, it would be incomplete if I don't ask you two things. One is that you put a lot of sort of onus or a lot of money on Mr. Narasimha Rao,
yes,
whom you say that he had navigated the political system successfully. You write about it, and you say that eventually he was the one who reformed the economy. One is Narasimha Rao part, and second, I want you to, in the culmination, comment, Mr. Panagariya, about the fact you write that Nehru's ideas, thoughts, workings had a lasting impression on our bureaucracy. Do you now, Mr. Panagariya, sitting in your position, again back working closely with the government, see that that influence is now certainly waning, and are we becoming more pragmatic? I don't want to take an anti or pro view, but more pragmatic in terms of dealing with what is necessarily required in terms of dealing with poverty eradication, as the first Prime Minister also aspired. Yeah. Are we becoming more pragmatic in that sense?
So first on Narasimha Rao,
yes,
most certainly I think he turned out to be a remarkable Prime Minister, right man for his time and all. I mean, partly as I described, that he perhaps understood Nehru quite well himself. He was a man of letters. He was a voracious reader. He used to write and all. So he actually understood him in the sense that Nehru, generally, as a general rule, Nehru would change with circumstances.
Yes, you have repeatedly cited that in your book, that he changed his mind, he was willing to accept advice, and he was malleable in that sense.
So he, in this sense, was also pragmatist. So therefore, Narasimha Rao felt that even when he's making these changes are well within the parameters that Nehru would be fine with, because the times have changed. So he talks about this, in one interview, the anchor asks him, that how did you make the U-turn? So he says, no, it's not like that. You don't make a U-turn. What you have to realize is that the ground on which you are standing is itself moving. And once you realize that the ground itself is moving, some sort of turn becomes easier. It's not a U-turn or anything. But so
clever answer from the old man.
Clever answer from the old man. Yeah. And so this is how he believed that what he did not do any damage to what Nehru had done.
Legacy.
And yet, as a very savvy politician, he not only made the changes, he navigated the change, sold it to everybody, and really transformed the country. I mean, in the end, what we see today, we owe to a very large degree to Narasimha Rao. And your second question on bureaucracy today,
yes,
I would say that there is no doubt we had made a huge amount of progress. There are a lot of champions of change and economic reforms within bureaucracy also. Without that, we won't get any changes. GST reform could not have happened, the bankruptcy code could not have come, corporate profit taxes which were reduced could not have happened. In the end, even though the politicians make the decisions, implementation is with the bureaucracy, and bureaucracy has to be on board. So there's a large number of, or at least substantial number of bureaucrats who
realists and pragmatists who have come,
who want change. Having said that, it is also the case that the central tendency of the bureaucracy still remains a bit of impacted by socialism. I think central tendency is not for change, it is to maintain the status quo. That is the central tendency. So the politicians in India have to work significantly harder to bring about a change. So it's not simply that the Prime Minister makes a decision and the change will happen. It will not happen like that. And some of the changes the Prime Minister has tried to make did not happen. And it's reflected mostly in the privatization. If you look at, Prime Minister had made a decision in 2016 when I was at the Niti Aayog to privatize many different public sector enterprises. But very few have been actually privatized. The bureaucracy moves slowly.
Let me then ask you, Mr. Panagariya, this final question, since you have had a long experience of working with the government also. Then in that sense, many observers would say that somebody like Mr. Modi, who follows and follows and follows scrupulously to the last detail, and your predecessor, Mr. N.K. Singh, once said famously that the difference between Vajpayee and Prime Minister Modi is that Mr. Modi has the capacity, immense capacity to follow through his decisions, unlike Mr. Vajpayee. Do you think that Indian bureaucracy generally needs politicians like that?
Well, if you want to
since you said that change, they need to work harder in this country.
Yes, if you want to bring about change, then yes, I think there is no question. In this sense, if you look at, I describe Prime Minister Modi as the holistic Prime Minister. He's not, Prime Minister for this or that. He does everything. Just see the change. First thing when he came, he said, Northeast. We have neglected, East generally, but Northeast especially. We have neglected. And see the amount of development he has brought about in the Northeast. Ports we had neglected. The Sagarmala project that he started, that development of islands, we have never done that. I remember day one when I had my first meeting as Vice Chairman of Niti Aayog, he talked about all these things, that we need to do these things. It took time to do, but economic reforms, GST, bankruptcy code, corporate profit tax, number of these things, and in the thick of COVID, for a whole week, the finance minister announced a package after package of reforms. So, in this sense, and the infrastructure, the way he has built, that I think, to me, takes away all kind of, predictions one could have made, the way, the scale at which, both scale and speed, which these are the terms he often uses also, are just most impressive. Take the new parliament building, take Mandapam, take the coastal road in Bombay, take the Atal Setu bridge. The projects on that scale we never did. Now we are doing actually, I was very impressed when I visited China as G20 Sherpa, what China had done. And I said, goodness, we are never going to be able to do things on that scale. But we are doing them now. We are really doing them. Also, again, in terms of the scale, look initially where he started, the Jan Dhan accounts. Suddenly, people said, no, you can't give accounts that fast to people, and we had taken so long to
open zero balance accounts.
So in that sense, accounts. Swachh Bharat, I think the toilets, right? 65 years of work, and only 38% of rural households had toilets. And he said, in 5 years, I'll do 100%. I thought, can anybody do it? But
so in that sense, you would say, in my final summing up commentary from you, that a clean break from the Nehruvian ideology helped.
Yes, indeed, of course.
Thank you, Mr. Panagariya. Thank you very much for sparing time for our viewers. Thank you for joining NDTV.
My pleasure. Thank you.